The UN chief, Antonio Guterres, has asked for $11.1 billion, the largest appeal ever made, to help Syrians affected by conflict, hunger and poverty. The European Union is hosting an international conference in support of Syria, where this year's earthquake aggravated the dire plight of people caught in civil war since 2011. The pledged money will be given to communities inside the country and also to neighbouring countries that are hosting more than 5 million Syrian refugees. The EU has pledged €560 million at that conference. And let's go to Brussels now, where our correspondent Rosie Burchett is standing by. Rosie, this is the 7th time the European Union hosts such a conference for Syria. Compared to the previous ones, what can we expect this time?
Well, Gerhard, the mood has been very sombre, and not least because compared to previous conferences in recent years, Josep Borrell, who's the EU's foreign affairs chief, says the situation has got worse on the ground and the needs are greater. Of course, in the past couple of months, that's in response to that dire, that deadly earthquake. But also, Josep Borrell, EU foreign affairs chief, pointed to a deteriorating situation globally. He mentioned not only the conflict in Ukraine, but also the conflict in Sudan. Now, last year at this pledging conference, there was at least $6.4 billion was raised. And according to EU officials I've spoken to, they are hoping to manage to get together a similar amount today. Pledges are still being made over the next few hours. We will see in the end if that meets the scale of the challenge. But I think you can expect that there will be some critics who say whatever they manage to, whether it's the same as last year or even more, it will not be to meet the scale of what Josep Borrell says he describes as unspeakable suffering.
DW's Rosie Burchett there reporting from Brussels. Thank you, Rosie. Today's conference in Brussels will notably not include any representation from the Assad regime, which is still sanctioned by Western powers such as the US and the European Union. Meanwhile, many countries in the Arab region, including long-standing US allies, have recently normalized relations with Damascus. DW's Aya Ibrahim has more.
With smiles and kisses, the Arab League, spearheaded by Saudi Arabia, unconditionally welcomed Bashar al-Assad back to the fold. A diplomatic triumph for the Syrian president after more than a decade of isolation.
But Western leaders, including here in Germany, still won't enter the same room as Assad, let alone shake his hand.
Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock warned against the warming of relations, saying Assad should not be rewarded for the most serious human rights violations, adding that every step towards Assad should be made dependent on concrete concessions.
So why are Arab governments rushing to cozy up to Assad? And does this mean the war is over?
After more than a decade of intense fighting, the war in Syria has reached a sort of stalemate and left the country divided. The Assad regime controls about 2/3 of Syria, including major cities like Damascus and Aleppo. Kurdish forces also control parts of the country. Sections of northern Syria are under de facto Turkish occupation. Others, like Idlib, are controlled by Islamist rebels.
The humanitarian situation across Syria is dire.
According to the UN, 90% of Syria's population lives under the poverty line. In the northwest of the country, more than 10,000 homes have been destroyed or partially destroyed because of the earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey earlier this year. We met with one man who lost his home in the earthquake and now lives in a camp.
There is no work. I do not have food to feed my children. We've been in this tent since our house was destroyed.
Arab governments that have re-established relations with Assad argue that this is the best way to actually help Syrians.
But many living in exile, especially those who called for democracy during the Arab Spring, disagree.
Whoever normalizes relations with this criminal is also a criminal, just like him. We're disappointed that the world is still trying to uphold and maintain the rule of a criminal whose crimes are clear for the whole world to see.
National interests are also behind the normalization of relations with Assad.
First, there's the refugee question. Large numbers of Syrians fleeing the fighting now live in surrounding countries. Arab governments are hoping that open communication with Assad might facilitate the refugees' return. Whether or not they would want to go back is a different question. Another issue is Iranian influence. The Assad regime was able to survive partially thanks to Russian and Iranian support, allowing Tehran to gain a foothold in the heart of the Arab world. This may be threatening to regional superpowers like Saudi Arabia, given its rivalry with Iran. Now the Saudis see a way to take back some of that influence. Arab leaders also want to clamp down on the Captagon trade. It's an addictive amphetamine-type stimulant pill that has flourished under the Assad regime. 80% of the world's supply comes from Syria, and large parts of that end up in countries like Jordan and Saudi Arabia.
So whether it is out of genuine concern for the Syrian people or because of national interests, many in the Arab region have decided that Bashar al-Assad will be part of his country's future, despite reservations from the West.
And for more on Syria's relationship with the rest of the world, I'm now joined by Simon Mabon. He's a Middle East expert and senior lecturer in international relations at Lancaster University in the UK. Simon, how much can Arab countries really help the Assad regime, taking into account that Syria is still under EU and US sanctions?
That's the million-dollar question. And I guess it's a really important one in the sense that right now the Assad regime needs money. Arab regimes, particularly those in the Gulf, have money, but they can't give it to the Assad regime as a consequence of US sanctions. So we're heading for a bit of a showdown, I think, here. The sanctions regime that's been put in place by the US and by the UK and EU has really impacted on the Assad regime's ability to reconstruct the country that, to be frank, he has played a central role in decimating. But reconstruction efforts, peace-building efforts are complex, are really problematic. And this, I think, points to a number of broader tensions within global politics and on the ground itself.
Well, let's talk about this and Syria's ties with the West, with journalist and Middle East expert Kirsten Hellberg. The German foreign minister wants concessions if ties are to be normalized. What concessions?
Well, there is a big dilemma, really, around this Brussels conference, because the donors, the big donors, have realized, obviously, that what Syrians need after 12 years of war are no longer food baskets and handouts, but what they need is a perspective. They would need resilience. They would need long-term programs to rebuild their lives, to have a safe future for their children. So how to do this when you don't have partners on the ground? Because the Assad regime has weaponized humanitarian aid in the past, and Assad himself would not be a good partner to do this, because we have seen how he has very effectively politicized the humanitarian aid that has gone through the UN. So the idea would be, for example, how to conditionalize humanitarian aid or early recovery funds by telling him, you know, we would be ready to rebuild parts of the outskirts of Damascus, for example, if you make sure that the original owners and inhabitants go back to their houses. Assad would never agree to this, because he was the one who deliberately displaced these people in the first place, because he doesn't want these people back now. They are his opponents. He considers everybody who stood up against his rule as a terrorist. People have left the country, so he doesn't want these people even back. And this is what makes it very difficult to think about conditions towards this regime that have not worked in the past.
Are there conditions that would work, that would get both sides talking and perhaps improve the situation for Syrians?
It's very difficult, and the official stances actually have not changed so far. I mean, the US maintains its isolation vis-à-vis Assad, it's maintaining its sanctions, it's even trying to hinder or to avoid an economic normalization by the Arab neighbors now with Assad. They want to make sure that this normalization stays on a diplomatic and political level, not making it an economic one, to not stabilize the regime even further. So they try to punch punish even countries in the neighborhood that want to give money, large amounts of money, to the regime directly. The EU maintains its official point of view that says that without a meaningful political transition, without real reforms from the side of the regime, we are not going to pay for reconstruction. We are not going to normalize with this regime. But in Europe, obviously, you have calls for a more pragmatic approach to Damascus, especially in Eastern Europe. You have countries like Poland, like Hungary, Romania, Austria that say, we should somehow opt to talk to the regime, or they are signaling a certain willingness to reach an understanding with the regime. So within the EU, the mood has changed a little bit, but I would say that we have two dynamics. I mean, we have on the one hand countries like Germany, the Netherlands, the US, France, that are trying to follow a path of accountability. They are trying to hold the regime accountable for the crimes it has committed during the last 12 years, opening lawsuits at the International Court of Justice, for example, like Canada and the Netherlands have just started one during the last few days. We have tried crimes against humanity by the Assad regime in Germany. And on the other hand, we have this normalization process and people saying that we have to talk to Assad to take care of the people inside the country. But as I said, Assad has not been a partner. What would need to happen is that the UN really impose their own principles of humanitarian aid by deciding who are the people in need, and by really giving access to all these people in need and not having Assad controlling this humanitarian aid.
Kirsten, just put it into context for us. How would you describe this plan for demanding accountability for Assad?
Demanding accountability is going through national courts by now, because the path through the International Court of Justice is blocked due to a veto in the Security Council and due to the fact that Syria has never signed the International Criminal Court's laws. So the aim is to really have national courts in European countries, for example, even in the US now, in other places, to hold certain figures within the regime apparatus accountable for what is going on. And we don't have to forget that these crimes against humanity are continuously taking place, especially the systematic use of torture within the regime prisons. We have more than 130,000 people who are still disappeared, who are in these security services prisons, who are being tortured. So this is the aim really of this, to at the same time not to block normalization, to make sure that this regime has to be held accountable before we can normalize, and to find other ways to help the people on the ground, to help maybe people in northern Syria, that in areas that are outside the regime's control, especially in northeastern Syria, where you have partners that you could at least talk to and try to build up infrastructure and to help people to really gain a more self-sufficient life, to come back on their own feet and not depending on food baskets and a short-term humanitarian aid that we have seen for more than 12 years now. This is not a perspective for people.
Syria's ties with the rest of the world, so much to take into account there, and so much for someone to be held accountable for. Kirsten, just tell us lastly, how much hope do you hold for the people of Syria? I know people who fled the country under awful circumstances and who would love to go back, but not under today's circumstances.
Yes, the big issue is security. And the big losers of this normalization process within the region are the Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries. In Lebanon, in Turkey, in Jordan, in Iraq, even in Egypt, they are very much afraid that they will be sent back by force, which is something that we've already seen in Lebanon. There are more than several hundred people have been sent back against their will. They have been deported since the beginning of the year. So they are very much afraid that normalization with Damascus will lead to forced deportations. They have to go back to a country where they don't feel secure. They say it's not so much about houses. We can deal with that. We can rebuild our lives. We can search for help, but we are not safe within the country. They are being afraid. And we have records by humanitarian organizations, international NGOs, that we know that people have disappeared and they have been put in prison after their return. So this is the big issue. And with Assad in power, that's not something to be solved very easily.
Kirsten Hellberg, it's been great talking to you about Syria's plight.
My pleasure.